something interesting happened with I don't want to call it a genocide because I don't think we know that that's what it is yet, but I do think it's headed that way. The situation of the Uyghurs is dire and does have a lot of elements that look flat out Nazi, frankly. Something fascinating about Majid's hunger strike. So I should say, I first became aware of the issue of the Uyghurs a couple of years ago. People started contacting me and saying, are you aware of what is going on? And their descriptions were so extreme that I actually found myself caught in a bind, which was, I don't know if I'm being dragged into something and being fed a false story, and I'm going to come out against this because, of course, I would be against this and I would want to shout it from the rooftops. But I'm going to say something and then I'm going to discover that's not happening. You've been misled by somebody. I don't want to wade into a battle that I don't understand. But then it became clear that actually this was taking place and it was very real. And I was trying to figure out how to address it. And then Majid, of course, cut the Gordian knot. But what I saw downstream of Majid's hunger strike was a lot of people who, were sort of in the top level of informed about world events, had not understood that this was taking place at all. And Majid's hunger strike actually called their attention to it. And there was this very interesting wave of people speaking out against this who I hadn't seen speak out about it before. And some of them acknowledged that they hadn't even known that it was happening. I saw Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Barry Weiss. Heather had not been aware of it. So anyway, the amount of good that Majid did with his hunger strike was spectacular. Not only is he getting the parliament to debate it by having gotten 100,000 signatures, but he has called a whole level of people who have an input into the global conversation. He's called their attention to it. So anyway, good on him for managing that. And, obviously the level of dedication it takes to engage in a hunger strike to bring attention to something is extreme. So it does say something very positive about him, which I think those of us who know him can't be too surprised. But there's a question about why this has not called more of the public attention. And I think a couple things are going on. One, the world that I was born into seemed very far from the Holocaust, right? The Holocaust seemed very distant and historical, but of course it wasn't. I was born in 1969, and that was really in the shadow of World War II more than I understood growing up. And so the level of discussion surrounding what had taken place was very high. I mean, probably much more so in Jewish homes than elsewhere, but the world had seen something after it had gone through a period where it had ignored it. So there was lots of evidence of what was going on in Eastern Europe, and other parts of the world had systematically ignored it until they could not ignore it any longer for various reasons. So there's something about the fact that we are much farther away from that event that has caused people to be less sensitive to what it is that took place and what its meaning might be. I also think there's probably something to the idea that in the West, for various reasons, the Chinese and the Uyghurs both seem very distant. And so I suspect there's something about the difficulty of getting people's empathic circuitry engaged when something seems very remote, which is unfortunate. I mean, it's absolutely our obligation as humans to put aside any distance that might exist and simply say, this is absolutely abhorrent and must stop. And the world has to come to grips with how it's going to stop this.
I also think there's one more thing at play here, and this is speculative, but I think we have been trained so deeply in America and probably Western Europe, Canada, maybe Australia, as well. To think of oppression as an inherently racial thing, so that when the Han Chinese and the Uyghurs are different ethnic groups, but to an untrained eye, we might not notice huge differences. Although I'm sure, if you grow up there, you can tell the difference. I think if the Uyghurs were black or dark skinned and everything else about the situation were identical, I have to imagine that the world would be paying a hell of a lot more attention. I could be wrong about that, but I think that's true. And if so, it says something unflattering about how our reactions are buffeted by skin color, um, or how our reactions fail to be invoked when the skin color of a group that is oppressing a minority group happen to be similar. Um, if so, that's a kind of a hidden cost of a racialized way of thinking about oppression. It's a kind of cost you would never think of unless someone like me posed that thought experiment. But I do see it as a cost nonetheless.
So the interesting test case is the Rwandan genocide, because the Hutu Tutsi distinction, as I understand it, was artificially imposed. And it's not to say that there was nothing ancestral about it, because it was imposed based on phenotypic characteristics which might have indicated different lineages, but nonetheless, it was arbitrary to an extent. And well, I guess I would ask, how do you think we reacted to the Rwandan genocide? As you would expect, not as intensely, because the skin color was the same on both sides.
That's a good question. I wasn't. I was born in '96, so I didn't view it in real time. But my sense is that we reacted more than we are currently to the situation of the Uyghurs. We didn't intervene to the extent we could have, but that at minimum elicited criticism and a very the dramatization of the event in the movie with Don Cheadle, a level of interest and attention that I think is unlikely to come about even 10 years from now. And grant that the situations are not identical. So far I haven't heard about the Chinese killing whole villages with machetes. And I just want to say I'm not super informed about this issue. I just know what I've read in the New York Times and a few other sources. I've heard disagreements about whether and to what extent there's forced organ harvesting happening. I've heard that there are Uyghur men that are taken to re-education camps, and their wives are forced to sleep with, are raped by Chinese soldiers. Again, I don't know what of this is true and what is not, and what's exaggerated and what's the harms I haven't even heard of that are going on. So I just want to issue a broad caveat there. But that could be one reason we're not hearing more about it. But I do think in that case, it would suggest that we're sort of uninterested in harm. We're sort of only interested in harms that affect darker skinned people. For some reason, something that a lighter skinned group does to another lighter skinned group doesn't elicit the same emotional reaction as something a lighter skinned group does to a darker skinned group, or a darker skinned group does to a darker skinned group.